She didn't look at him. That was the problem. In a world where every woman turned, every room leaned toward Duwon like gravity had quietly rearranged itself in his favor, she stood at that crowded beach bar in Busan and refilled her drink without a single glance his way. Dark locks trailing down her back. Hips that rewrote silence into something dangerous. And an indifference so complete it landed on him like a challenge he didn't know he needed. He would chase her. He would break his own rules for her. And by the time she realized what she'd walked into, she'd already chosen to stay anyway. Welcome back to Alira Stories. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and turn on post notifications. Your support means everything. Now, enjoy the story. Studies show that people become more attracted to those who seem indifferent to them. Psychologists call it the mystery effect. This story is built on exactly that. Ganza never tried to draw him in, and that's precisely what made her impossible to forget. Have you ever been drawn to someone who wasn't chasing you? Tell us below. The party had swallowed the entire stretch of Houndy Beach. Bass-heavy music poured from speakers mounted on driftwood frames. String lights cut gold across the dark water. Strangers laughed with the ease of people who had forgotten their real names for the night, and the air tasted like salt and cheap soju and something electric that had no name. Ganza moved through it all with the quiet precision of a woman who had learned, very early, that a crowd was not the same thing as company. She wasn't unhappy. She was just unbothered. There was a difference, and most people never bothered to learn it. She reached the bar at the far end of the setup, a long wooden table stacked with bottles and plastic cups, and poured herself a drink without ceremony. Watermelon soju. Cold. She'd earned it. 3 weeks into her fellowship at Yonsei University's International Research Program, and this beach party had been her first real exhale. She let herself breathe. She watched the ocean. She thought about nothing. She did not notice the man who stepped up beside her. Duwon arrived at that bar the way he arrived everywhere, without announcement, without urgency, and yet somehow making the space rearrange itself around him. He was broad-shouldered in a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his jawline sharp enough to cut conversation mid-sentence. He had the kind of face that read differently depending on the light, beautiful in warmth, dangerous in shadow. Right now, the string lights were doing him no favors. Or too many. He poured himself a drink. He glanced sideways. She wasn't looking at him. He waited a beat. 2. 3. She sipped her drink and watched the water. Duwon Shin, the man whose name moved through Busan's port districts and nightlife circuits like a quiet storm warning, stood next to a woman who did not appear to know he existed and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not attraction. Not yet. Something stranger. Curiosity. He let it sit for a moment. Then, because he had never once needed to try, he let something effortless slip into his voice. You look like someone who came to this party by accident. Ganza turned her head, looked at him fully for exactly 1 second, and then looked back at the ocean. I did, she said. My colleague dragged me. It's not terrible. A pause. The soju's decent. She said nothing else. He blinked. In 11 years of moving through rooms like a force of nature, no woman had ever responded to him with a sentence about soju and then simply returned to watching the water. He almost laughed. He almost introduced himself. He almost did the thing he always did, lean in, lower his voice, let the weight of his attention work the way it always worked. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she held her cup. Maybe it was the absolute absence of performance in her posture. She wasn't pretending not to notice him. She genuinely wasn't interested. He walked away without another word. And that, inexplicably, was when it started. 3 days later, Ganza was at a cafe near Gwangali Bridge when she looked up from her research notes and found him sitting 2 tables away, reading something on his phone with the focused calm of a man who had nowhere better to be. She stared for a moment. He looked up, met her eyes, didn't smile, just held the look for a breath, then returned to his phone. She told herself it was coincidence. Busan was a big city, but its good neighborhoods had a way of shrinking when you stayed long enough. She went back to her notes. An hour later, when she stood to leave, a server appeared with a fresh cup of coffee and set it in front of her. From the gentleman, he said, and pointed at the empty table across the room. Duwon was already gone. Ganza looked at the coffee. It was exactly what she'd been drinking, which meant he'd been paying attention without appearing to pay attention. She sat back down slowly. She drank it. It would be wasteful not to. The second time he spoke to her properly, it was raining. She had been caught outside the university's main gate without an umbrella, a rookie mistake she blamed entirely on the morning weather app, and was standing under the narrow overhang of a convenience store, willing the rain to be reasonable, when a black car pulled up to the curb and the window rolled down. "You're going to be there a while," Duwon said. "That's not going to stop for at least another 40 minutes. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I checked the radar." A pause. "Get in. I'll drive you wherever you're going." Ganza pulled her bag tighter. "I don't get into cars with strangers. We've met. Twice. Briefly. One of which you didn't even speak." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "3 times," he said. "You don't remember the second." She frowned. "The cafe. That was only the second. There was a bookstore in Siamine 4 days ago. You spent 20 minutes in the history section. You were wearing a yellow cardigan." He said it without inflection. As a fact, not a confession. Ganza went very still. "You should be concerned that I noticed," he said, reading her silence correctly, "and I don't have a good explanation for why I did. But I'm not dangerous to you." A beat. "I don't lie either. That's not one of my better qualities." The rain hit the awning in sheets. She got in the car. His name was Duwon Shin. She found that out on her own, later that night, after he dropped her at the university gate with nothing more than a polite nod and no request for her number. She sat in her room and typed his name into a search engine out of the particular self-preservation instinct that every woman develops by her mid-20s. What came back was not reassuring. There were no criminal records, at least none that were searchable. But there were photographs at high-profile events. His name attached to shipping companies, port investment groups, private hospitality ventures that the articles described in careful, well-lawyered language. One old tabloid piece, years ago, linked him loosely to a Busan business network that the writer had clearly been afraid to name directly. The piece had been removed, but a cached version survived. She read it twice. Then she closed her laptop and stared at the ceiling. She was not naive. She was a researcher by training and by personality. She gathered information, waited, made decisions. She had just gathered information. The decision should have been simple. But she kept thinking about the way he said, "I don't lie," not with pride, but with something almost like resignation. As if honesty were a burden he'd accepted rather than a virtue he'd chosen. She went to sleep thinking about it. That was the second mistake. He texted her 3 days later. She didn't know how he had her number. She didn't ask. The text said, "There's a jazz bar in Namchen. Not a date. But the music is better than anything near the university." She stared at it for a long time. She typed back, "How do you have this number?" His reply was immediate, "Your colleague. The one who dragged you to the beach party." I asked politely. She was going to have a conversation with Sujin. She went to the jazz bar. It was small and warm and lit in amber, the kind of place that existed quietly between the visible world and the real one. A 4-piece ensemble played something slow and unhurried in the corner. Duwon was already there when she arrived. Of course, he was sitting in a booth near the back with 2 drinks already on the table, and that particular stillness he carried everywhere. She slid into the seat across from him and skipped the preamble. "You're not what you present yourself as." He looked at her with something that might have been respect. "No. The shipping companies. The port connections." She kept her voice low and even. "I looked you up. I assumed you would. And you texted anyway. Because you're still here." He leaned back slightly. "You could have ignored it. You're not a woman who does things she doesn't want to do." Ganza picked up her drink. "I came for the jazz." "Of course. And, because you said it wasn't a date." The music shifted into something softer. He watched her the way she'd caught him watching her exactly nowhere, openly, steadily, without pretense. "Is there a version of this that you'd be comfortable with?" he asked. The question surprised her. She hadn't expected it to be that direct. Or that careful. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. "That's fair." They listened to the music for a while in silence that did not feel like silence. It felt like something being carefully built. By the end of that week, she knew 3 things about him that the internet hadn't told her. He read history obsessively: Korean, European, East African. He had strong opinions about the Joseon period that he delivered with the particular passion of a man who had thought about it far more than anyone around him probably knew. He drank his coffee without sugar. And when someone at the bar that second evening leaned over to speak to her, a well-dressed man named Cheol-soo, who had perhaps misread the situation entirely, Do-won did not intervene. He didn't speak. He simply shifted in his seat so that his presence at the table became architecturally undeniable, and looked at Cheol-soo with an expression so flat and so final that the man excused himself after 45 seconds. Ganza had seen it. She hadn't said anything. Afterward, Do-won refilled her glass and asked about her research as if nothing had happened. She found that she liked that more than she wanted to. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap like and drop your thoughts below. Now, back to the story. 3 weeks in, and Ganza could no longer pretend she didn't look forward to his texts. They were never excessive. One every day or two, sometimes a question about something she'd mentioned, sometimes a location or a recommendation, once a photograph of a sunset over the Gwangan Bridge with no caption at all. She'd stared at that one for a minute before setting her phone down and going back to her reading. She wasn't falling. She was being very careful not to fall. But she was leaning. And there was a difference. A smaller difference than she would have liked. It was Soo-jin who said it out loud, because Soo-jin had no boundaries and no shame and was, despite both of these things, consistently correct. They were eating tteokbokki at a market stall when she set her chopsticks down and looked at Ganza with the expression of someone preparing to say something true. "You like him?" Ganza kept eating. "He's interesting. He sent you food to your office building 3 times this week. It's just..." Ganza. Soo-jin's voice was gentle in the way that sharp things sometimes were. "I know who he is. I knew before I gave him your number. I gave it anyway because I've seen how you look when you talk about him, and you look like someone who's trying very hard not to be happy." A pause. "He's not a simple man. But he's not pretending to be one either. That counts for something." Ganza was quiet for a moment. "He scares me a little," she admitted. "I know. Not because of what he does. Because of how easy it would be to stop being careful around him." Soo-jin nodded slowly. "Then maybe," she said, "the question isn't whether to be careful. Maybe the question is whether careful is the only way you want to live." She didn't have an answer for that. Not that night. But 4 days later, when Do-won showed up at the university's public lecture hall where she was presenting a segment of her fellowship research, sat in the back, said nothing, and afterward sent a single text that read, "You're brilliant." That's not a compliment. It's a fact. She stood in the emptying auditorium and felt something in her chest loosen that she'd kept deliberately tight. She called him. He answered on the second ring. "You came to my lecture," she said. "I did. You didn't tell me. You would have been nervous." She laughed before she could stop herself. It was involuntary and genuine, and she heard the pause on his end, the briefest break in his composure, before he said, quietly, "That's the first time I've heard you laugh like that." She pressed her hand to her mouth. "Don't make it something." "Too late," he said. And she could hear, underneath the words, that he meant it. That was the night she stopped pretending she was going to walk away easily. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't have to. What she did instead was agree to dinner, not jazz, not coffee, not a place they'd been before. A real dinner at a restaurant overlooking the harbor, where the table was set like someone had thought about it in advance, and he was already standing when she arrived, which she hadn't expected. And the look on his face when he saw her was the kind of look a careful man only lets out when he forgets, just for a second, to keep it in. She sat down across from him. He didn't say anything right away. Just looked at her. "You're staring," she said. "I know. It's rude. I know that too." He picked up the menu. "You look extraordinary. I thought you should know." Ganza kept her face composed. "Thank you." "Not a compliment," he said, echoing his own text. "A fact." And, just like that, something that had been a possibility for weeks became a direction. Not safe. Not simple. Not anything she would have chosen if she had been choosing carefully. But real. Undeniably, dangerously real. The dinner lasted 4 hours. Not because they ran out of things to say, the opposite. They kept finding new corridors in each other, unexpected rooms that opened the moment one of them said something unguarded. He told her about growing up in Busan's port district, the third son of a man who moved cargo for a living and believed that the only honest measure of a person was what they did when no one was watching. She told him about Kigali, about her mother's insistence that education was the only thing the world couldn't repossess, about leaving home at 19 with one suitcase and the particular loneliness of being brilliant in rooms that hadn't been built with her in mind. He listened the way very few people listened, without preparing his next sentence while she was still speaking. "You miss home," he said, when she paused. "Every day." She turned her wine glass slowly. "But I've stopped treating that as a reason to go back before I'm ready." He was quiet for a moment. "That takes discipline. It takes practice. There's a difference." He looked at her the way he kept looking at her, like she was solving a problem he hadn't known he had. "You do that a lot. You correct the frame." "The frame is usually wrong," she said simply. He smiled then. Not the careful, controlled version she'd seen in public. Something quieter and more unguarded, something that belonged to a smaller room than the ones he usually occupied. She filed it away. Told herself she wasn't collecting pieces of him. She was absolutely collecting pieces of him. The shift happened gradually, and then all at once, the way most real things do. By the 5th week, she was no longer surprised when his name lit up her phone. By the 6th, she had a drawer in her mind specifically designated for things he'd said that she kept returning to without meaning to. He had started showing up at places she'd mentioned in passing, not intrusively, not obsessively, just with that infuriating, precise attentiveness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. He paid attention the way other people breathed. Automatically. Completely. He sent her books. Not gifts wrapped in intention, just books. Slipped into her university mailbox with no note, or sometimes with a single sticky tab marking a passage. She read every one. She never told him that. He was learning her. She knew it. And the more unsettling truth, the one she examined late at night when she was being honest with herself, was that she was letting him. The problem arrived on a Tuesday, which in Ganza's experience was when most problems chose to arrive quietly, without the dignity of a dramatic entrance. His name was Ren. Japanese, mid-30s, attached to a business delegation from Osaka that had been in Busan for a week negotiating something she had no details about. He was handsome in a deliberate way, charming in a rehearsed way, and he appeared at the rooftop gathering that Sujin had pulled Ganza to with the specific energy of a man who had spotted something he intended to pursue. He found Ganza near the railing. He introduced himself. He was interesting enough in conversation, and she was polite in the way she was always polite genuinely, but with a slight distance that she kept without effort. What she didn't notice was that Duwon was there. What she did notice, 20 minutes into the conversation, was that the temperature around her had shifted in some indefinable way, not physically, not literally, but in the way that pressure changes before weather. She turned her head. Duwon was standing 12 feet away, talking to someone she didn't recognize, holding a drink with a stillness that would have read as relaxed to anyone who didn't know his baseline. Ganza knew his baseline. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved to Rin every few seconds with the flat, controlled precision of someone who was being very deliberate about not reacting. She excused herself from Ren politely and made her way over. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. Evidently. His voice was perfectly level. "Are you enjoying the party?" "Duwon. He's been standing close to you for 20 minutes, he said, still without looking directly at her, and the restraint in his voice was so precisely maintained that it was somehow louder than anger would have been. "He's just talking. I know what just talking looks like." A pause. "And I know what interest looks like. He's interested." Ganza tilted her head slightly. "Are you jealous?" He looked at her then. Full, direct, undisguised. "Yes," he said, with no performance attached to it. Just the word, flat and honest. "I don't enjoy it." She held his gaze. Something moved in her chest, not triumph, nothing as small as that. Something larger and more frightening. Then maybe, she said carefully, you should figure out what you want to say about that. She walked back towards Sujin. He watched her go. He had the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion that had been building for weeks. He called her the next morning at 7. She was awake. She was always awake early, another thing he had learned, and she answered without preamble. I'm not good at this, he said. No greeting. No setup. I want to be honest about that first. She sat up slowly. I know. I've spent a long time operating in a world where attachment is either a liability or a transaction. I don't have good models for what I'm trying to do with you. A pause. What I'm trying to do with you is something different. I want you to know that I know the difference. Outside her window, Busan was beginning its morning noise. Distant traffic, gulls, the particular low hum of a port city waking up. She pulled her knees to her chest. What do you want, Duan? The silence that followed was not evasion. It was precision. He was a man who chose words the way he chose everything, deliberately. You, he said. Without conditions. Without games. Just another pause. I want to be someone you don't have to be afraid of. Ganza closed her eyes. She thought about what she knew. The business networks. The late-night calls she'd seen him step away to take. The life that existed parallel to the one he showed her. She was not blind to any of it. She had never been blind to any of it. She thought about what Sujin had said. Whether careful was the only way she wanted to live. I'm not afraid of you, she said quietly. I'm afraid of how much I've stopped being careful. Those are different things. I know. She opened her eyes. That's what makes it hard. She said yes. Not to a title, not to a formal declaration, just to him, to the specific and complicated shape of what they were building. She said it over dinner 2 nights later, with the harbor lights behind him and his hands on the table and his face doing that thing it did when he was trying to contain something large. I know what I'm getting into, she told him. I want you to know that I know. I'm not romanticizing you. I know, he said. And I need you to be honest with me. About everything you can be honest about. Always, he said. Not a promise performed for the moment. A fact delivered for the record. She nodded. Then okay. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and certain, and she looked down at it for a moment before looking back at him, and what passed between them then was not a beginning, they were past beginnings. It was more like an acknowledgement. A mutual choice, made with full information, against better judgment, for deeply felt reasons. The most human kind of decision. The weeks that followed were the best and most destabilizing of Ganza's adult life, and she was fully aware of both of those things simultaneously. He was extraordinary at the particular kind of love that looked like logistics. He arranged things not intrusively, not as control, but as care translated into the concrete. When her housing contract at the university ran into complications, a solution appeared within 48 hours that she didn't ask about too closely. When she mentioned once, briefly, that she missed a specific Rwandan tea her mother used to make, it appeared in her mailbox inside a week. When she worked late, there was always food. When she was anxious, he didn't try to fix it, he just stayed close, steady, present, which was precisely what she actually needed and had never known how to ask for. He was also, she understood increasingly, a man with a life that operated outside the edges of hers. Late calls. Meetings that weren't described. The particular practiced blankness that came over his face when certain topics arose. She didn't press. She had agreed to this. But she felt the weight of it, the quiet accumulation of things she chose not to look at directly. And then the night arrived when the two worlds collided in a way she hadn't prepared for. She had been waiting for him at the restaurant they'd made a habit of, corner table, Harbor View, Tuesday evenings. He was late, which he almost never was. When he arrived, he was still and controlled in the way that meant something had happened, and he'd already processed it to a point where he could sit across from her and eat dinner and say nothing. She let him. For 40 minutes, she let him. Then she set down her fork and looked at him. Tell me what happened. His jaw moved. It's handled. I'm not asking if it's handled. I'm asking what it was. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he told her not all of it, but enough. A dispute within his network. A former associate who had pushed at something he'd protected. An ultimatum delivered, then resolved. No physical harm. No danger that extended beyond his own world. But the reminder, sharp and clear, of what his world was. Ganza listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" she asked. He blinked. Slightly. Like the question had arrived from a direction he hadn't anticipated. "Yes." "Are you sure?" Something moved across his face, something swift and undefended. "No one asks me that," he said. "I know." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, reversing their original gesture. "I'm asking." He turned his hand over and held hers. His grip was very tight for just a moment, controlled immediately, but she felt it. All the tension he was holding in his body, finding one place to acknowledge itself. "I'm all right," he said again. Quieter. Truer this time. She nodded. She didn't let go of his hand. The real fracture, when it came, was not dramatic. The worst ones never are. It arrived 3 months in the form of a rumor delivered to her by a mutual acquaintance, with the particular cruelty of people who believe they're doing you a favor. A woman. A dinner, seen by someone, photographed by someone else. His name in the same sentence as a socialite from Seoul who orbited his world in ways that predated Ganza by years. She didn't confront him. She was not that kind of woman. What she did instead was go quiet, a specific, deliberate quietness that was the emotional equivalent of drawing a door closed. She answered his texts briefly. She canceled Tuesday. She worked late in ways she hadn't worked late in weeks. He noticed immediately. Of course he noticed. He came to the university. Not to her office, he had more precision than that. He waited at the cafe across the street, and when she emerged at noon, he was simply there, and the look on his face when he saw her stopped her on the pavement. "What did you hear?" he asked. She adjusted the strap of her bag. "It doesn't matter what I heard." "It does, actually. Because you're somewhere I can't reach right now, and I need to know where the door is." His voice was very even. "Ganza. Talk to me." She looked at him for a long moment, the broad shoulders, the sharp jaw, the man who had dismantled every careful wall she'd built without ever raising his voice. The man whose life she knew was bigger and darker and more complicated than the parts he showed her. "There's a photograph," she said. "You and someone else. Dinner." He didn't look away. "That was before you. That woman and I have history that ended before you and I ever began. I will tell you everything about it if you need me to." A pause. "Nothing in my life is happening around you. I need you to understand that." "How can I know that?" "Because I don't lie," he said. "You know that. You've tested it for months." She had. Quietly, carefully, in the way she tested everything. And she had not caught him in a lie. Not once. The wind off the harbor moved through the space between them. "I need a day," she said. "Take it. Don't text me." "All right." She walked past him. He let her. That restraint, the not following, the not pushing, the giving her the space she asked for, was perhaps the most unexpectedly powerful thing he had ever done. She took the day. She called her mother. She sat with herself in the apartment and did the uncomfortable mathematics of what she was risking and what she would lose if she walked away from it. The next evening, she texted him one word, "Dinner?" He responded in 3 seconds, "Tuesday table." "I'll be there." She arrived first. He came in and looked at her across the restaurant and crossed to the table with the directness of a man who had spent the previous 24 hours doing his own difficult mathematics. He sat down. He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "But I need you to know that this costs me something. Staying. Trusting. It's not free." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for free. I'm asking for the chance to be worth it." She held his gaze. "Then be worth it." "Every day," he said. "Starting now." The months that built themselves on top of that conversation were different. Quieter in some ways, deeper in others. He moved things around in his world, not everything, not overnight, but the visible edges of his operation began to soften. Less late calls. More honesty about the ones that still came. He introduced her to his older brother, a straightforward, decent man who looked at Ganza with the particular warmth of someone who recognized that his brother had finally found a fixed point. She stopped bracing for the moment she'd be proven wrong. Not completely. Not all at once. But the fist she'd kept clenched around her own heart for the whole of her adult life began, slowly, to open. He proposed on a Wednesday, which was not Tuesday, and not a grand gesture, and not a performance. They were on the balcony of his apartment, watching the harbor lights, drinking the Rwandan tea he kept buying for her, and he turned to her mid-sentence about something unrelated and said, "I want you to stay. Not in Busan. With me. Permanently. Marry me." She looked at him. "That was not eloquent," he said. "No," she agreed. "It was perfect." They married in the spring, a small ceremony, Busan harbor behind them, Sujin crying harder than anyone, his brother standing straight and proud. Her mother flew in from Kigali and spent the first hour examining Duwon with the precise, measuring quiet that Ganza had clearly inherited, and by the end of the evening was showing him photographs on her phone while he nodded with genuine interest. Ganza watched it from across the room and felt something settle in her that had been restless for years. 7 months later, at a hospital overlooking that same harbor, she held a small, certain, unhurried person who had her forehead and his jaw. Duwon sat beside the bed, not performing composure for once, just holding her hand and looking at this new thing with an expression she had never seen on him before, completely open, completely undefended. "She's going to have your eyes," he said. "Let's hope she has your calm," Ganza said. He looked at her. Shook his head. "She should have yours." "That's better." Ganza looked down at the person they'd made together. Outside, Busan moved through its morning, ships, seabirds, the low tide pulling back from the shore. She thought about the beach party. About the bar. About the moment she'd refilled her drink and not looked at him, and how that one act of ordinary indifference had set everything in motion, all of this, all of them, this small and enormous life. She hadn't chosen carefully. She had chosen honestly. And the difference, it turned out, was everything. If this story pulled you in, like, comment your thoughts, and stay subscribed, there's more coming.